Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to our Fellows Public Talk series. I'm Claudia Rizzini, the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to remind everyone to ask questions using the Slido link. The link is provided here on the side of the room for our audience in the room and in the chat feature of the Zoom webinar for our online audience. You should feel free to ask questions at any time throughout the program, and we will address them at the end of the talk. Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce Tracy K. Smith, our Susan S. and Kenneth L. Wallach Professor at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Tracy K. Smith's voice is one of the defining through lines of 21st century American poetry. Unafraid to plumb the depths of personal grief or confront historical and present-day racism. Across 5 collections of poetry, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning Life on Mars, multiple librettos, and 2 books of nonfiction, Tracy questions the prevailing narratives of American history. Her work charts visions of life that reach for the stars and dig at the roots of family trees. Tracy's most recent book of essays, To Free the Captives, meditate on Black resilience across generations, from her grandfather's service in World War I to American upheaval in the summer of 2020. While serving as U.S. Poet Laureate from 2017 to 2019, Tracy's used her platform to demystify contemporary poetry and increase its accessibility for Americans in communities large and small. During those 2 years, she launched the podcast The Slowdown to celebrate poetry's place in our lives, giving everyday listeners an opportunity to hear a new poem and analysis each weekday. In her year at Radcliffe, Tracy is working on a book-length exploration of another American poet who put daily life, particularly Black daily life, at the forefront, the late Lucille Clifton. She hopes readers will see in Clifton's pale lyricism and her view of Black vernacular speech a vehicle for the oracular, the ways in which we are united by human consciousness, moving together as a part of one large celestial whole. Tracy's talk for today, On Being Nobody, comes from a collection of essays she's just completing, entitled The Opposite of Love is Fear, Poetry as a Spiritual Technology. The Q&A portion of the public talk today will be moderated by Tracy Hux, who is the Susan Young Murray Professor at Harvard Radcliffe Institute and Victor S. Thomas Professor of Africana Religious Study at Harvard Divinity School. And now please join me in welcoming Tracy K. Smith to the podium.
Good afternoon, and thanks for being here. I want to begin with gratitude, not just to Claudia for that lovely introduction and to Tracy for agreeing to be the moderator for the Q&A part of my presentation, but to my Radcliffe fellows, my fellow fellows, and to the Radcliffe community in general. It's such a gift and an honor to be able to have the time and the inspiration to think in a way that is hard to do during a teaching year. So I'm immensely grateful for the work that I'm able to undertake here in this space. I know my talk was advertised for a little while as a talk about the Lucille Clifton project, and so instead of orchestrating a total bait and switch, I decided to work her into my presentation a little bit. I think she's welcome in every discussion about poetry and American life. And she was also my teacher for a year when I was a grad student at Columbia, so she'll make an appearance. But I would like to begin with a poem by Emily Dickinson that I've written about in my memoir, Ordinary Light, as one of the texts that made me really wake up to poetry and feel summoned by a voice on the page. And it's a poem that you probably, possibly have encountered at some point in your reading life. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'd banish us, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog, to tell your name the livelong day to an admiring bog. Reading that poem for the first time at age 11 or 12, the speaker's delightful animation and the sense of collusion that she invited me into felt activating. But I also felt the power of words like dreary and livelong, words I seldom myself used. Dreary to me was a word that signaled the particular gloom of boredom, but livelong conjured ardor, the exhaustion of being too busy at something too burdensome. One of the only places I had heard that word used before was in a song that we kids were often encouraged to sing. Maybe you know it. I've been working on the railroad all the livelong day. Dickinson's nobody, I understand now, was compelling to my child self, in part because I recognized in words like dreary and livelong something uncomfortable and unsettling. And that's because that song, I've Been Working on the Railroad, like other popular children's songs from my childhood, has its origins in minstrelsy. These tunes were originally charged with enforcing the impression that blacks sang and fooled, beholding their lot in life not just as brutal or unjust, but merely dreary. Minstrelsy as an art form originated to reinforce and codify the notion that black people, economic pawns, were nobodies, inconsequential, unworthy of empathy or genuine regard, like the speaker in yet another popular minstrel song who sings over and over again, "Oh, Susanna, don't you cry for me." The legacy of racial caricature had bearing upon my life, even as a child growing up in the 70s and 80s, and it had something to do with what made the paradox of Dickinson's nobodiness so compelling to me. Because to see her speaker reject or refuse the external world's terms of somebodiness affirmed the depth and discernment a quiet part of myself knew I possessed. To stand alone or to be willing to revel, confident in an unexplored or unadvertised complexity, and to know enough to guard such capacities as precious. Suddenly, the popular people, the institutions authorized to judge me, and even the part of me that sometimes felt willing to become less myself in order to fit in with those and other sites of longing, suddenly all of that became the distasteful league of frogs, belching and bellowing out from a cold bog. Now, I didn't know anything about Dickinson when her poem first held me in thrall, and yet its rebuke to systems of validation that fail to recognize certain of us or to see us correctly came through. The people who snub, judge, and expect the worst of us. The feeling of being sized up and passed over. Dickinson's nobodiness was a refusal to accept diminishment, a way of saying, I draw my authority from within. And yet there's more. Because the assurances that I'd grown up hearing, from my parents especially, reminders that I was wonderful and capable and unique in the world, all of those things were given to me most fervently in moments when I had felt the blow of exclusion, the feeling of having been left out or misseen. And so I wonder if Dickinson's poem, and actually much of poetry in general, is an earnest attempt on the behalf of the poet or their imagined speaker to build the self back up from a moment of disillusionment, undoing, or doubt. After all, A large part of the consolation of poetry stems from the fact that poems emerge not from what poets have already mastered, but from the lessons and realizations they're compelled to reckon and struggle with over and over throughout the span of a life. The ease with which an external gaze, bringing with it conscious and unconscious motives and expectations, can enact a form of erasure upon its subject is part of what the chapter that I'm right now excerpting and compressing offers to the reader. And it does so in part by way of readings of poems by poets Victoria Adukwe-Bulley and Harriet Mullen. But it does that at length, and so it's not really possible to bring much of that here. But I also think that tendency and the sense of urgency that it activates in somebody who's on the receiving end of forms of erasure comes through in the work of Lucille Clifton. And so I'd love us to look at one of her poems, and I'll kind of back up a little bit and say that Clifton's entire body of work centers upon and forms a constellation around the sanctity and the complexity of Black life. Her project moves through history, mythology, politics, through an investment in ecology, religion, sexuality, and more, asking us to become more alert to all that we routinely miss when we obey the terms of regard that in this country and elsewhere project a sense of abjection, threat, futurelessness, or impoverishment upon Black people, Black stories, Black lives. So her work seeks to correct this misconception, and she does it with love, with joy, with laughter, with compassion, often stern compassion, and also by way of a series of prophetic poems that run through her books, poems that are engaged with the supernatural, either by way of dialogue with beings who perhaps had once been human or never been human, and also ongoing dialogue with deceased members of her own family, like her mother and her husband. So Clifton's work is also in dialogue with with poets like Dickinson, Whitman, Milton, others who I think of as being outside of the community of Blackness. And so this particular poem, Whose Side Are You On? I actually view it as a reformulation of Dickinson's nobodiness. Whose side are you on? The side of the bus stop woman, trying to drag her bag up the front steps before the doors clang shut. I am on her side. I give her exact change, and him, the old man, hanging by one strap, his work hand folded shut as the bus doors. I am on his side. When he needs to leave, I ring the bell. I am on their side, riding the same late bus into the same someplace. I am on the dark side always, the side of my daughters, the side of my tired sons. I like to just kind of mark the occasion of a poem's title. It's something that announces an expectation or a direction of thought, something that activates certain expectations or questions in the reader's mind, and then you descend down that little inch or so of space to land in the realm or the world of the poem and see how those expectations or questions will be met, answered, deflected. And so this poem, without delay or any qualifications, moves to answer the question for you by way of the speaker. And the answer brings us to the people that Clifton or Clifton's speaker willingly identifies and aligns herself with. The first indication of that is that word bus stop, or that phrase bus stop woman. It's almost a new noun. And what I read there is an awareness of people who are contained in incorrect or inadequate terminology, people whose lives are larger than our vocabulary for who and what they must be. But she's also invested, even as the poem says, in kind of everyday terms, in people for whom doors are closed, not just bus doors, but doors of possibility, opportunity, doors of support. people asking for change, and not just the exact change that the speaker offers, but transformation, shifts in patterns, and shifts in horizon. And she's also invested in people whose lives from the outside are viewed as devoid of nuance. She complicates all of those terms and habits as throughout her body of work by stepping in close and defining a kind of ongoing relationship with these lives. And in this poem, I hear it pretty emphatically in the first 3.5 lines. Think about how the verb, the choreography of the movement of a woman outside the bus trying to heave this bag up into the bus and to do it in time before the buses close. I feel like that description is almost heaved upon the reader in a visceral way. We bear the weight of that and the hope, perhaps, that everything's going to fit inside and she'll get to where she's going. There's also something that I would describe as like a generative abstraction in this poem, and this is something that's a pattern in Clifton's work. So I'm thinking about a word like someplace, or the construction into the same someplace, where she takes these words that are often empty words that gesture toward the vague, or something that the reader or listener must complete with their own, experience of reality, and she asks them to become larger and stranger and perhaps more rich than they otherwise are. I hear the same someplace also as a correction to the notion that some people are presumed to be going no place or nowhere. Always does this work as well, especially for people who have read more of Clifton's work. So this poem lives in her collection called Quilting, and in the title poem, she uses some other where to describe an alternate view of possibility within the scale of familial Black life. And elsewhere in that book, she uses the word always twice. Once as the word we recognize, ALWAYS, and once right after that, all, ALL, ways, as a way of emphasizing that this is a word in which everything is possible and that is constantly the truth. The last thing I'll say about this poem, although I realize we probably could have just looked at 2 Clifton poems for the whole duration of this talk, is that this is a sonnet. It doesn't announce itself as such because it doesn't have the classical rhyme schemes or patterns, but there's definitely, as I see it, a kind of circling or reversing of something that's laid out initially. And if that is true, then I take the final 2 lines as something like the poem's version of a heroic couplet, maybe an ordinary couplet because the people in the poem that are centered are regular folk. But she draws them into not just the human family, but into her version of family by bringing into the picture the side of my daughters, the side of my tired sons. So I want to carry Clifton's largeness of regard. If we were in a classroom, I would really want to hear what you think of this poem, but maybe we can do that at lunch, or we can do it during the Q&A for this and the other poem that we'll look at. But for now, I want to carry Clifton's largeness of regard back into my own current chapter's interest in erasure, both as a psychic or perspectival violence that we enact on one another, knowingly and unconsciously, and also as a mode of documentary poetics, making use of found or archival materials through redaction or some other reframing or reformulation. So unlike the erasures that we endure and perpetuate in life, erasure in poetry is a method of operating on that which remains to many undeciphered within the field of a familiar text. By a further tilt of the imagination, I think the practice of erasure asks us to conceive that which remains as yet unimagined in the field of what passes for common reality. And I'm really interested in this sense of common reality, that we live in the same thing, because I feel like it's so urgently contested. And when we accept it, it's often dimmed and with a lower ceiling of possibility, as if common reality is something that's ugly, that's limited, that's not, VIP, like so many of the things that we're drawn toward as consumers. So in inviting readers to look more closely at or listen more intently to what's been taken for granted or accepted without question, erasure is a way of countering some of the everyday negations that diminish people, all of them unique and essential on the human plane, into figures insignificant in the scheme of power. So the redaction of an existing text unburies some unexpected testimonies, or it asks us to imagine what happens when something that's intended for a specific audience is opened up for a wider field. As a poet who works in this mode increasingly, and I find that I do that because I feel that history has so much to say to us that we haven't yet allowed it to, I understand there are some pitfalls. And one is this: if I adopt a text that I want to erase or redact in order to find something specific, in order to put someone, let's say, like Thomas Jefferson or Woodrow Wilson in their place, my poem will fail. My poem is going to be a manifestation of my own certainty, my own smugness, my own ego and righteousness. But if I can say I'm moving toward this text, and with it toward the voice and imagination of someone who is no longer bound in the life and the allegiances to which we normally associate them, something else can happen. And so what I'm saying is erasure can be a form of collaboration if your imagination allows you to take that step into a kind of credulity, whereby you're working together with this other author, this other imagination, this other energy to unburden the text from the constraints of its original purposes. And so I'll share one of the first erasures that I did. It's a poem called Declaration, and I wrote it in April of 2017. I'm going to skip over a slide we probably won't have time for to share it with you. And I started writing this poem because I'd been working on a poem about Jefferson, and my poem was falling prey to that wish, that willful insistence that I needed to put Jefferson in his place. And I knew it was failing. And so I thought, what if I listen for some scrap or shred of Jefferson's voice in this document, this living document that he co-authored with others? What would happen? What would he be able to reveal to me? How could we find each other? And the first thing I noticed was when I sat over the Declaration of Independence with that intention, I realized that I had never opened myself up to it in the way that listening for Jefferson's voice and his message to me required me to do. In other words, it had never occurred to me to read that public document with the openness and the emotional vulnerability or availability. I want to call that with the expectation of intimacy that I would sit down to read a poem and bring out. So I say that because to enter into a poem, you are endeavoring to write or read is to be met by this unwavering source of attention, a voice that has rushed, like Dickinson's voice, rushed breathless across all this distance of time, space, circumstance, in order to reach and, for some reason, to entreat you. I had a teacher when I was an undergrad here named Lucy Brock-Broido, and she said, this is all a poem is. It's someone coming up to you and saying, hey, come here, let me tell you what it was like. And you enter into this dynamic of, love for a little while. So what if the voice that reaches you, like Jefferson's on its path that day to me, belongs to someone who in their own lifetime may never have chosen or even deigned to address you in such a way? What becomes imaginable or even possible then? And what if I were to insist that it felt as though Jefferson and I were facing one another not as strangers, not as adversaries, but as co-evils, as two souls sparked at the same instant from eternity? I'll let that hang in the air and I'll read this poem. Declaration. He has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. He has plundered our, ravaged our, destroyed the lives of our, taking away our, abolishing our most valuable, and altering fundamentally the forms of our. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here, taken captive on the high seas to bear. What animates or haunts this poem for me is a willingness, as I imagine it, on the part of one of the originating imaginations of this text to lend this appeal for freedom from an unjust colonial authority to me, and with me, my entire race. I was moved to find such direct parallels between the document's cited grievances against the government of England and generations of Black people's pleas to this country for freedom and a full portion of citizenship and justice. As I see them, each of the dashes in my poem opens onto a surging sea of examples, and I think the spacing of the poem also seeks to enact that sense of movement or flow. One line that startled me as I was writing the poem or deciphering the poem is, "and altering fundamentally the forms of our," which my ear involuntarily completed with the word families. But the dash there insists that there's always another answer, another layer of evidence and possibility willing to lend itself to each of these gestures. And I hope that invites you as a reader to populate the poem's silences, which are its redactions, with other understandings of what has been held or what is present. I gave a reading of this poem in Washington, D.C. soon after it was published, and an audience member came up to me and said the final dash in the poem is completed in her, imagination with the word witness. And she activated a possibility that hadn't previously occurred to me. I'd been thinking of the weight, or what I often describe as the freight of history, in drawing that line toward into the poem. But both are compelling, and I don't think one has to win out over the other. Sometimes I'm asked by students or readers, well, which is it, this or that? And my answer is often, if a poem urges you to notice both are present and active in the poem. Both can be useful. I think there's another thing happening in a poem like this, and this is the thing that I will never be able to prove to you, but maybe I can convince you. I believe that there is an equation in the world whereby language plus time equals clarity. And by clarity, I mean the unburdening of any text from the rigidity of its original purpose or intention. And so Jefferson, wherever and whatever he now is, maybe he's another soul in a different kind of life, or he's a form of energy at work in the universe, who knows? Wherever and whatever he is, he's able to see the larger or farther flung truths to which his once ago voice might be freed to apply. And so his words drift forward, reconfiguring themselves to be of use to new purposes. I think that's true of all of our voices, all of our words. If it's possible even simply to imagine that such a form of regard exists, should it not have some bearing upon what we might be allowed to expect for and from ourselves? And I like to take that thinking a step farther and say, well, should it not have bearing upon what we are allowed to expect from the institutions that purport to serve us as well? But this is where we'll come back to the page a little bit more, and the experience of common reality. This is where I think, all of the work of founding fathers and ordinary folk culminates in the atmosphere we live in, this common reality. If there really is such a thing, something we move through each day beside others as actual as ourselves, why do so many doubt it? Why do they need to doubt that circumstances real for me are things to which you too might be susceptible, that the bus stop woman might be susceptible to something that was real for Thomas Jefferson, or the reverse? I'm thinking more so of a lot of the slogans that we're hearing lately, these great cries that are rising up as countercalls to the calls for justice and inclusion that we're hearing and that we've been hearing for some years, which I read as frustration that has mobilized into statements like "Take America Back" or "All Lives Matter," which I take to mean your justice, your America, your history, your reality do not and never will apply to me. But where the terms of common reality have been calibrated to the ego's demand to stand above and apart from others, I think poetry operates as an equalizing technology. A poem's speaker, its reader, and the material constituting its subject occupy something like a uniform plane. Nothing is towering over the other. No circumstance is too far away from you, the reader, to be greeted with an intimacy of regard. We all sit level at the feet of the poem's conundrum, which grows near and familiar in response to our participation in the poem's unfolding. I'm going to move toward a couple of documents that feel so important to my understanding of common reality, but that are not poems. But I think that to read them with the kind of investment that poems ask us to read with is to be drawn into a fuller and more useful form of reality. So you'll see, you'll barely see probably the text on these pages, but it belongs to a letter written in March of 1865, actually dictated by a freedman named George Washington, and it's a letter to President Abraham Lincoln. So the little backstory I'll tell you is that Washington resided on Hilton Head Island in South Carolina. That was a community liberated from the Confederacy early in the Civil War, and blacks who fled plantations on the island and on the mainland were deemed contrabands, and they were brought into freedmen's encampments with schools, given jobs, and there's a sense of listening, happening, and hoping in these places. A lot of freedmen enlisted in the U.S. Army colored regiments because of that sense of hope. And so I'll read you an early segment of Washington's letter. He's been watching Lincoln's career, I think like a lot of people in his position, from early on. He says, "I love you freely. I am now 53 years old. Inauguration Day was also my birthday. I have come 278 miles from Savannah and from there to Hilton Head. I've lain awake 4 nights, and my mind so bore upon you that I could not rest till I sent you a letter. I lived in Butts County, Georgia. I'm obliged to send you this to satisfy my mind. I wish you all the blessings that can be restored by the Almighty." So like a poem, sometimes a letter can act for its author as a proxy for the ideal recipient, the perfect receptive ear and heart. And in this letter, I can hear Washington's prose yearning towards something that goes beyond the desire to connect to Lincoln as a public figure, and more toward the sense of reuniting with somebody who has lived in his imagination for a long time. I hear that urgency with, I've lain awake 4 nights, I couldn't rest until I sent you a letter. So Lincoln has become one of Washington's intimates, and as such, he feels that he owes him something. And I love that idea that someone who has inspired great feeling to you is owed something from you, perhaps even just the sense of contact or outpouring of your feelings and thoughts. I want to think about time a little bit, so I might go a little quickly, but this is an image of George Washington's namesake, who we can understand to be President Washington, with a man who was enslaved to him at Mount Vernon named William Billy Lee. And I show it because it's the opposite of the kind of loving regard that Washington claims between himself and this public figure. I can see that if there were somehow a meeting arranged, which there was not, between the author of this letter and the recipient, it would be framed in such a way as to beatify Lincoln and to relegate the huge-hearted Washington to the shadows and the sidelines, as happens in this portrait, which is consistent with portraiture of its kind. But I'll go on a little bit farther with Washington's letter, because I think it demonstrates something about the way he's intervening or offering to intervene into common reality. So he says, I'd go back to see my family. I'd be glad to. I love my wife and children. At that time, I had a vision, and you was made known to me in a dream. I saw a comet come from the north to the south, and I said, good Lord, what is that? I heard a voice, there shall be wars and rumors of wars. I saw many signs and wonders. My soul is filled with joy at the pleasure of letting you know. I have had a heap of high mountains and deep waters to cross. My master threatened my life if I should talk about this, but I just put all my trust in the Lord, and I believe he has brought me conqueror through. I give my mind to pray for you the balance of my days. An essential yet undertended feature of our shared stewardship of common reality is the ability to do what Washington does, which is see across these rungs, as I see them, of division between, the different levels of the national hierarchy that we're taught to believe we belong to. So he's peering up at the person probably at the very top of that social ladder, and he's saying, we have something to say to one another. I have something to share with you that can change your understanding of what you're doing, what this enterprise is. Given what the familiar holds, my master threatened my life if I should talk about it, I can understand how it's critical that Blacks learn to lift their gaze beyond the known toward the needful or the hopeful and even the impossible. Isn't this in and of itself a likely reason why the letter's author has been named George Washington? Because someone understood that important people and important events were indeed relevant to a child, even one born into enslavement. I also locate power in Washington's visionary imagination, an imagination that is, in its ability to claim the miraculous as imminent, quite poetic. And I'm not just talking about the generic sense of that word, like colorful or expressive. I'm talking about poetry as a philosophy of being, which makes Washington willing to leap into a view of reality that admits the essential role of metaphor. And not just metaphor as something that is expressive, but metaphor that brings something from a different or seemingly wrong context into range where it is needed and where it is useful. He's willing, in other words, to pitch his imagining beyond the radius of ordinary occurrence. I see him as a messenger and also an architect of a radically distinct version of common reality. But in the time that remains, I'd love to look at one other letter. This is a letter from a widow named Mrs. Jane Welcome, and it's also written to President Lincoln in about 5 months before Washington's letter. She writes, Mr. Abraham Lincoln, I want to know, sir, if you please, whether I can have my son released from the army. He is all the support I have now. His father is dead, and his brother, that was all the help I had. He has been wounded twice. He has not had nothing to send me yet. Now I am old, and my head is blossoming for the grave. And if you do, I hope the Lord will bless you and me. If you please, answer as soon as you can, if you please. They say that you will sympathize with the poor. There was a white gentleman told me to write to you. Mrs. Jane Welcome, if you please to answer it. He belonged to the 8th Regiment, U.S. colored troops. Mart Welcome is his name. Sorry, the 8th Regiment, Company A, United States Colored Troops. Mart Welcome is his name. So I encountered this letter when I was invited to write a poem for the National Portrait Gallery's commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War. And I wanted to contribute something, but my hackles went up because I've always felt conflicted, let's say, by debates about what the real cause of the Civil War was. But I thought that if I could turn toward people whose destiny hung in the balance as to which way the war and abolition would go, if I could listen to their testimonies of what their investment in the war was about, perhaps I could find something that I could draw into a poem. And by draw into a poem, I mean, I poured over letters like this, and also deposition statements that veterans of the war gave in an attempt to claim pensions, and that was a challenge for people who had born into slavery to do. And I thought I was going to first metabolize all of this and then write a poem in my own voice that set the record straight. Again, every time I try and set the record straight, I know I will fail. The poem will fail. And when I got to the middle of this woman's letter, and she said, "Now I am old, and my head is blossoming for the grave," I said, what am I doing? These people are writing poetry. These appeals are full of life force and breath. They're not finished yet, and I believe their lives are not finished. They're still unfolding, and we are involved in that unfolding. And when I read that line, I thought of something like a pumpkin flower, which takes some time to form on a plant that is grown from a pumpkin seed. First we wait, then there's a season of all these leaves stretching out, and then this yellow-green little thing sort of begins to sprout and stretch and open and turn bright yellow. And at its center, there's a pistil or an ovary, which is the hope of harvest, the pumpkin. So what does it mean when Jane Welcome says, "I am old and my head is blossoming for the grave"? What does it mean to bear fruit not on the way to death, but for death's very sake? I suppose she's talking about generation, how the generations of a family flow from one to another, and how a mother flowers, foretells, and feeds the true fruit, which is a child, how her work is to ensure that flourishing. To do so, or to have done so, is to have completed a vitally important task, not just in one life, but in the life of humankind. What is humankind but the past, present, and future of common reality? And so this woman has undertaken such a feat from the constraints of enslavement, which is kind of like an impossible task that she has been victorious at. She's asking, would her president see fit to grant this request? I wasn't any longer conducting research at that point. I had entered into this other understanding of what reality is all about by this voice leaning out from the page across a century and a half to reach an attending reader. And even now, it strikes me that her voice persists into every present in which somebody hears it and might hold it in heart and mind. So I'll end with this question, and I think it has some bearing on the positions and the forms of willingness that poems really serve to strengthen and reactivate. And I think they're willingnesses that are innate to us as humans, but our culture's fixation on separating us from one another and offering us different things and justifying that, rewarding obedience to that, has dimmed our ability to claim these capacities that are ours. Is it freedom that has so often driven America to war against itself? Not freedom, but our conception of it as an altitude to which some are born and toward which most must struggle, too often for naught. How we squint up at its peak, shrouded in thick mist. We've been taught so well to discern the sight of it, to know who is at home there and who a guest, that we take this gaze, this way of watching with us everywhere, casting it upon others, peering through it back at ourselves. But what we permit ourselves to hear has bearing upon what we are able to see. And a poem is a voice offering to build the world by means of some crucial fragment anew. A voice overcoming all manner of distance in order to soothe or astonish, entreat or rebuke, and not just the reader, but the self as well. To ponder what has not yet been seen, what has eluded capture. To alter fundamentally the forms of our... I'll leave it there. Thank you. Hello.
Thank you so much for that rich presentation. This is a time when the audience, both here and the more than 1,000 who have registered for this online, can get a chance to engage that really rich presentation. And I wanted to start with a question about the craft of the poem. You invoke the poem, the power of the poem as an artifact, as a roadmap, as an avenue for redirections. These are your words. A journey of discovery and envisioning, and poetry as a philosophy of being. Can you explain for non-specialists and non-poets what that symbolism means?
Yeah. As a poet, I am asked a lot, like an infuriating number of times each April, which is National Poetry Month, this question: does poetry matter? Why does poetry matter? And I think my answer is going to be something like, does mystery matter? Does awe matter? Does courage matter? Does resilience matter? Does our interest in the lives of other people matter? Do our actions and their bearing upon the planet matter? Poetry is an art form that disarms us and that says all of the things that buffer and protect you in your experience of the reality that you've chosen are going to fall away for the time it takes for you to read this poem, which seeks to speak to you on a soul or a heart level, which will engage with you cognitively. You can reason with and you can even judge the poem, but those are low-level operations. What the poem seeks to do is to awaken you to what it feels like to inhabit the fuller reality that we often deny ourselves. And there is much need for you there. And so for me, it's a way of saying, oh my gosh, I want to be present in the real. A poem gives me practice at what it feels like to discern, to care about, and to respond to the real. When I'm reading a poem and when I'm talking about poems with others, especially people who are intimidated by the art form, I say, you have everything that you need in order to fruitfully engage with this poem. What you need to do is pay attention to what you notice, what the poem causes you to remember, to wonder, to want, to hope, to worry about. When your mind wanders as you're reading a poem, you are being a productive and active reader because you're entering into an act of what I think of as co-creation. You're saying, well, these things are relevant to the poem. Let me bring them into this space and see how they operate within and upon the terms that are up for discussion. And so, as I see it, that's a really great way of being alive to the world, but I also have such an interest in our civic life that I really believe this is great practice for citizenship, because it means the sides that we're encouraged to declare. And I think Clifton's poem is a way of saying, I am encouraged by every institution in this country not to be on the side of these people. And so the poem helps me labor to remain there. And those sides sort of become inconsequential when the poem asks you to do this large order kind of work. So that's part of what I mean by a philosophy of being. It's also maybe just a willingness to say, I will risk feeling, and I will risk changing as a result of what this poem is going to invite me to deal with and to feel. Lucille Clifton used to say that she wrote poems to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And I think both of those things are really necessary. Poems put us in that position, and the more we do, I think the better we become.
Oh, thank you for that. And thank you for invoking this notion of co-creation. I wanted to share with our audience that we have between us a table of light. And as someone who works on African-derived religions and Africana religious studies, you know, this light is a space where ancestors are welcome. And I thought it was an important space between the two of us because you invoke ancestors in your work. Even in this presentation, you're invoking Emily Dickinson. You're invoking, you know, the freedman George Washington. You're invoking Mrs. Jane A. Welcome. You're invoking Lucille Clifton. But you're also listening and hearing Thomas Jefferson as well. And, you know, the question is, I wonder if there's a moment when you are writing that you sense a co-presence, or if, like George Washington, the freedman, you experience visions or dreams or signs or wonders. Fundamentally, how does the sacred enter into your work?
I love that question. When I was a younger writer, I would say I am trying to listen beyond my own known voice for other voices and notions that can be useful to me. And I was sort of timid at that time, and so I said, maybe what I'm listening for is my unconscious mind. But I now claim to be listening for these other life force energies that I believe are among us. And I think I've become more adamant in that in the years since the pandemic, when I had really such a heavy reckoning that I couldn't deal with the freight of my own life on my own, and I couldn't find anyone who could help me. And what I began to do was to meditate, and that practice, which I talk about in To Free the Captives, became a dialogic process. And so I would say, I had a question for anyone, and this thought would form in my mind that wasn't mine, or a word I could see, you know, almost as if it were being stenciled in neon for me to read, that didn't come from my own vocabulary or even my own language, and it was relevant. And so I began to feel a kind of credulity, like I am in the universe, and there are others here who have the desire to be useful to me in my struggle. And so I willingly enter into that kind of collaboration as I sit down to make art now. I even brought these little cards. A few years ago, I edited a divining deck. Turtle Point Press has these little decks it's about the size of a tarot card deck, but it has lines from poets. So they have one by Rumi, they have one by Emily Dickinson, one by Yeats, and then I said, you must have Clifton because she was so involved in spirit life. And so maybe she can answer one of the questions that comes up there. I just feel like even if you are willing only to say everything I'm saying is a metaphor, I think it is a useful metaphor. And it might be a way of saying human consciousness is larger than we give it credit for being. And if it can go beyond ourselves toward, you know, what we imagine or remember, it can go and sound in these other ways and be useful even to the person from whom it originates. And that's fine with me too. but I like to think about what these flickering lights are in the presence of as well as real.
One of our audience members said, as someone who lived through the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, I wonder, and this is Lucille Clifton, I wonder what role does religion play in Lucille Clifton's work?
It's an interesting role because she, in some ways, cleaves to some of the messaging that I know my parents received as members of the Black church in the segregated South. Like your life is sacred, you matter, God, you're essential and unique in the realm of creation, even if the institutions that we live with deny this through law. We know that we're in the human family, we're in God's family. But there's much more there too for Clifton. She is really interested in religious history or mythology, and so she explores it as a way of exploring human dynamics, as a way of saying, I'm going to position Adam and Eve as a Black couple in the Garden of Eden, and I'm going to bring all of my interest in the mythology of paradise and the fall and the serpent. She loves to write about Lucifer, and she said, well, my name is connected to the origin of his name, which is light. There's a poem from this sequence called Lucifer Speaks, which ends with the line, illuminate I could, and so illuminate I did. And she felt that her purpose was also to illuminate, and sometimes it's a fearsome reality to say, I'm interested in the job that the serpent was given. I think it's a job that he performed. How does that change my understanding of these other facets of the religious cosmology? So that's one thing. Yeah, if we could project some more poems, I would love to trace that out. But there's a lot of investment in these stories, these archetypal stories. And I think anytime you are bringing these lives that our culture says are beneath the level of myth and using them to reframe mythology, you're correcting a misperception that has taken root. And I think that's a lot of what her work is seeking to do.
In the larger version of what you presented to us, you talk a bit about your childhood in there. And one of our audience members has asked, concerning your poem Declarations, that they would have ended it with, to bear children. In both senses of bear, meaning endure, tolerate, produce. How is this both and space of poetry and poetry making something you see intimated in your earlier poems?
I love that. That really ties in beautifully with the purpose of Jane Welcome's letter and the urgency of her appeal, which was denied ultimately because it wouldn't have served the needs of the war. But yeah, to persist, to continue. How does that sense of possibility tie into my earlier work? When I was first writing poems as a student here, and then as a younger poet, I was really invested in the authority that I viewed the poets I loved to have. And I read or located that sense of authority in their ability to make statements that were compelling and convincing. And so I would always start writing poems with what few compelling, convincing statements I felt like I could make with authority. And then my poem would be about this long and I would stop. I wouldn't have anything else that I was authorized to declare, and I would have to put it away. And then I start, and maybe I bring that up because to imagine that one ending of a poem excludes the usefulness of another, the reader has offered this alternate ending, would be to say, I'm the authority here. This is my show. But I began to realize that my poems could only get longer and more interesting to me if I actually did what was more natural to me, which was to ask questions. And questions are limitless, right? They invite myriad possibilities to come in and be useful. And I think maybe moving through the world with questions is a fruitful enterprise, more so than saying I will answer and nail down and limit and delimit things. But I think my practice has changed in many other ways as well.
Many of your poems discuss difficult topics, but still leave the reader hopeful. What are the ways you stay hopeful?
I had to become comfortable with hope when I became a parent. My cynicism wouldn't let me off the hook because I have these 3 lives that, like everyone, like Mrs. Jane Welcome, are more important to me than my own. And if I am without hope, it means I'm just leaving them to deal, you know. But to be hopeful for me means to be useful. How can I intervene in some of these erroneous perceptions that we have, and dangerously erroneous perceptions that we have, even through something like a poem? How can I temper the default imagination? And I'm not just saying that about readers. I publish books of poems for a living, but I sit down to write poems without any interest in my reader. I'm asking my questions, and I'm trying to figure out how I can keep going in the face of what feels too heavy or too gloomy to see beyond. And so I'm trying to talk myself into another view or understanding, even with something like grief, which means this person is gone. Your life with them as you knew it is over. I'm looking to find something that can offer me a desire to persist in some other way. And so the enterprise is creation. I have to create these possibilities through language, through form, through sometimes harmonizing with other literary voices or voices in other art forms to come towards something that feels momentarily clarifying.
We are almost out of time.
I'm going to let Lucille Clifton answer this next question.
Okay, well, we will let Lucille Clifton answer this final question. And it's actually about readers, something that you said about readers, that over centuries, generations, and time, you state that the author's voice, it persists into every present into which it might be heard and held in heart and mind. And as you reflect on your own corpus of work, including your recent book, To Free the Captives, A Plea for the American Soul, what is the message that you as author, as poet, would want to persist into every present into which it might be heard?
That is a big question. This is what Clifton's deck offers. What then of the moon, the room, the bed, the poetry of regret? And it's a question. Maybe I'll try and bring that toward my answer, which is, I don't have a message as a poet, but I think I'm hopeful that what I do in language and form can make someone else invested in maintaining this human project. And it's actually, maybe one other thing I'll say about Clifton, it wasn't just a human project that she was aware of, right? This is a cosmic operation. The planet, all life forms that we recognize and many that we don't are also watching and waiting to see what we resolve. And so maybe it's just an invitation to take part in this thing.
Yes, we are out of time, but I wanted to end with my favorite Emily Dickinson poem. And she says it in the form of a benediction. And Dickinson says, in the name of the bee and of the butterfly and of the breeze, amen. So amen to you and to your work. Amen to our audience questions.
Thank you.
And for our audience, both here and live stream, we hope you'll join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.